Welcome to Do You Ever Wonder with your host, Mike Haltman. It's the podcast that will answer your questions about many of the things in life we've always wanted to know more about. Our guests, experts in their chosen field, will enlighten us about subjects ranging from real estate, business, career, science, philanthropy, and much more. Proudly presented by Hallmark Abstract Service, it is once again time to sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride on our information superhighway. And now, here's Mike Haltman.
Well, welcome everybody. And indeed, my name is Mike Haltman. I am the CEO of Hallmark Abstract Service. But for this podcast of Do You Ever Wonder, I am going to be your host. So tonight's episode is going to be very interesting. We're going to touch on the multifamily real estate market in New York. And one of the issues with the real estate market or the multifamily real estate market in New York is that it can be, to some extent, used as a political pawn in many respects. So if you look at constituencies, if you look at a lot of people versus a little number of people, then you have the landlords and building owners versus the tenants. The tenants are the vast multitude of people. The landlords and building owners are smaller in terms of sheer numbers, but by the same token, many of them are also small mom and pops. You know, the big real estate multifamily conglomerates that you think of when you think of commercial housing in New York, they don't control most of the units in New York. So today, we're going to talk about something called the Good Cause Eviction. And basically, Good Cause Eviction, we'll get into the details of that, but it piggybacks on something that in 2019 was the first shot across the bow of the multifamily market in New York. And that was the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act. And basically what that did, under the guise of protecting and helping and taking care of the tenant, was to put in a lot of restrictions on the landlords. One aspect of that law that particularly gets to me a little bit is limitations on the amount of money that can be apportioned to, and our guest today can correct me in all of the places that I'm wrong, but where a landlord can do renovations in an apartment and then whack it up over, I think it's 60 some odd months, and add that to the rent, they put a cap on that of about $15,000, I believe, per apartment. So in effect, what that does is for the landlord that was going to come in and renovate a kitchen, and that kitchen could cost $30,000 or $40,000, why is that landlord going to do that when it's going to all come out of his pocket and he can't apportion that to the tenant? By the same token, the lobby, by the same token, any other improvement in the building. If he's going to have to, or she is going to have to foot the entire bill, then that landlord or building owner will probably not do it. So the end result is that while on its surface, it seems to be protecting the tenant, at the end of the day, when the building begins to fall apart, it's actually the tenant who's going to pay that price. So that was the 2019 law, which encompassed a lot of other things that I'm not going to get into now. But the good cause eviction, and I don't know why I have so much trouble with that name. I'm going to call it GCE for short, because that's I guess the acronym it goes by, was supposed to be, or potentially was going to be, included in that 2019 bill, I believe, and was not. But through the magic of politics, that GCE is now back and is kicking and is once again potentially going to pass. And again, it's just another, I don't know if you would call it knife in the back, nail in the coffin, just another series of law that is going to make it very difficult to entice people to be a building owner. I believe it'll probably put a cap on the value of apartment buildings, and probably is not overall fair, but all is fair in love and politics. So all of that said, I would now like to introduce our guest, Alex Lycoyannis, and I probably pronounced that wrong. How do you pronounce your last name?
Lycoyannis.
You know what? That was going to be my second guess. He is a partner at the law firm Rosenberg and Estes, which is, I believe, in the last Real Deal rankings I saw, the biggest in terms of sheer attorneys that practice real estate.
Right. Yeah. I think the last 3 years we've gone from number 1 to number 2 to number 1. And I'll take the opportunity to add that in 2020, our litigation department won the Real Estate Litigation Department of the Year award from the New York Law Journal.
Fantastic. So obviously it's a pretty good law firm. And we're lucky to have Alex as our guest. And when it comes to good cause evictions, I'm not going to say that you're enamored by the subject, but you do seem to have somewhat of a passion for that subject, and come down on the side of fairness and the building owners and landlords.
Yeah, I think that's to put it kindly, that's a fair statement. So first of all, Mike, thank you for having me on, and hello everybody out there. So you're exactly right. So I think in order to really fully understand what good cause eviction is and what this bill means, I think it would help the listeners to take a kind of step back as to how New York real estate is set up in terms of rental real estate, rental real estate. So generally speaking, right, and I'm going to talk about New York City here for the most part. I know there might be people in other parts of the state, but my firm is focused in New York City, and most of these laws are understood based on how they affect New York City, because it's one of the it's the hugest rental market in the country, and one of the biggest ones in the world. So generally speaking, you've got 2 buckets of residential apartments. You have one bucket that has where the rent that's already subject to a rent regulation regime, right? And that's in New York City. That's about 1 million apartments that are subject to rent stabilization. So, and there's a very, very small number of that are subject to an older rent control regime. I'm not gonna talk about that for now. So bucket 1, you have rent stabilized apartments. The other bucket you have are free market apartments. So in a free market apartment, you can come in and whatever the parties agree, the lease terms are going to be, whatever the rent's going to be, that's what the lease agreement or the agreement is going to say. There are some laws that govern free market apartments, but for the most part, it's a free market. Okay. You mentioned in your opening about the HSTPA. Okay. The HSTPA, again, for the most part, governs the rent regulated, rent stabilized apartments. You mentioned the concept of an individual apartment improvement. So if you have a rent stabilized apartment, one of the many I would call it draconian things that the HSTPA did was it severely limited the amount that an owner can recover for the improvement of an apartment, right? So just like you said, for almost anything you do, an owner has to do to update an apartment, it's not economically feasible to do it. I think if you actually do the math, the most an owner can charge to recoup an apartment improvement to a stabilized apartment is like $83 a month. Like you can't do anything for $83 a month, especially now with the inflation we're having. And rent stabilized apartments, especially after the HSTPA, it's a very, very tough business to be in right now. But you still had that other bucket of free market apartments, right? So if you have a building with, let's just say 20 apartments, 10 of them are rent stabilized and 10 of them are free market. You have all those restrictions put on the rent stabilized units, by the HSTPA and by the pre-existing rent stabilization law, but you could make up for that because you still had the free market apartments, right? So now, of course, the existence of those stabilized apartments drove up the free market rents on those other apartments, but an owner could still make a go of it because they still had the ability to charge and make up for what they couldn't charge on the stabilized apartments. So now the good cause eviction bill that's currently pending in the legislature, it was initially in the HSTPA, it was taken out during the process, but now 3 years later, they've come back to try to finish the job that they couldn't finish.
They're back.
They are back, and it is a horror story for everyone. And as you indicated, they may be trying to stick it to to owners, but it's like that old saying from when you were a kid, right? The saying that if you point a finger at someone, you have three fingers pointing back at yourself. If the advocates here are trying to really stick it to owners, but at the end of the day, they're going to stick it to tenants as well.
Not to be political, because I try not to be political, but again, it's the short-term headline versus the long-term ramifications. And by the time the long-term ramifications come around, they won't be in office anymore. So it's that's why, as we talked about before we went onto this, people really need to really discover what the viewpoints and what the goals and what the past actions of people who they're going to vote for really are. But there are about 5 aspects to the good cause eviction. And one of them, the first one is the good cause eviction can be for non-payment of rent. However, if a landlord raises the rent and the tenant disagrees with the raised rent, they cannot pay that rent pending, I guess, an arbitration, or how does that exactly work?
Okay, so there are what this bill does, right? And I think, again, taking a step back to really understand how this bill works, right? So let's use an example. Okay, so let's say, Mike, you are the owner of a building and you signed a tenant up for a 1-year lease from January 1st, 2022 to December 31st of 2022. Okay, so let's just take that example. Let's just take let's say good cause eviction didn't exist, right? So if January 1st, 2023 comes around and the tenant does not leave, you can start what's known as a holdover proceeding or an ejectment action. You can start a proceeding in court to get the tenant out. Okay, it's one of the most straightforward cases you can bring in court in landlord tenant or real estate or in any area of the law. Okay, very, very simple. So now in the current world we live in, there's a chance that this good cause eviction bill will pass. Okay, and what happens if it passes in its current form or something approaching its current form? Let's take the same example again. You signed this tenant up on January 1st, 2022 for a lease expiring December 31st, 2022. Good cause eviction passes, let's say in June of this year. Okay, so January 1st, 2023 comes around, your tenant doesn't leave, and you reach out to them and you say, hey, what's going on? Your lease expired, you're still here. Tenant can say, you know what? I really like this building and I like this apartment and I'm not going anywhere. And by the way, here's the rent that was due under the lease. And you say, no, but I don't want you to be here. Like, I want to rent to someone else. And the tenant's going to say, no, I want to stay and there's nothing you can do about it. Unfortunately, the tenant will be right and you'll be wrong, because the most fundamental thing that this bill does is it removes the expiration of a lease as a basis to get a tenant out. So if a tenant is in, that tenant can stay forever. There's no the concept of a lease for a 1-year term or a 2-year term is done, finished, over. If that tenant wants to stay for 60 years, that tenant can stay there for 60 years, and there's nothing you can do about it. As long as they pay the rent, as long as they don't cause a nuisance, as long as they don't operate it as a drug den or something like that, they can stay forever. And that's the most revolutionary part of this bill that no one is talking about.
That's unbelievable. You know, my brother-in-law lives in San Francisco, and he's my age. I'm not going to tell you what that is, but he's been living in the same rent-controlled apartment for, I guess, probably about 40 years. And he probably pays under $1,000 in San Francisco. And even through sale of the building, they can't get rid of him. I mean, it's really an unbelievable thing.
Yeah.
And will destroy the saleability of buildings.
I mean, you compare what this bill does, right? You even compare it to rent stabilization in New York City, right? We just talked about, and you have the HSTPA. Even in a rent stabilized building, you have the rent guidelines board that sets the rent increases. So you know that you can raise the rent a certain amount every year. Theoretically, they're supposed to take into account the various expenses and different circumstances that go into running a building. And it's a political process, but at least theoretically, you're going to be allowed to raise the rent. You're going to be allowed to some degree, keep up with expenses.
Hopefully not inflation anymore.
Yeah, well, that's a whole. We could do a whole other podcast on that. But this bill, right? So if you talk about increasing the rent, one of the things that people in the discourse I see about the bill, a lot of people assume that there's a 3% rent cap, right? So you can raise the rent up to 3%, and that's wrong. That is not accurate. Okay, what this bill says is that if you raise the rent, right, and the tenant doesn't pay it, okay, you can bring the tenant to court for an eviction proceeding if they don't pay the rent. But the rent increase cannot be unreasonable. What does unreasonable mean? That's a good question. The bill doesn't explicitly define unreasonable. What it says is that if you raise the rent more than 3% or 1.5 times CPI, the Consumer Price Index, whichever is higher, that is presumptively unreasonable. So let's say you raise it 10%, right? The tenant doesn't pay. You'll still have the opportunity to go to a judge and say, well, I had to raise it 10% because I needed a new roof and there was a leak and I had to replace the windows and this happened and that happened and I had to pass along the cost. Okay. So theoretically, you could get that 10% rent increase. But number one, the tenant's going to have the opportunity to oppose. Number two, you're going to have to pay an attorney to make this case to a court. Number three, the judge might disagree with you. Okay. And so anytime you want to raise the rent or something happens where you need to recoup your investment in the building, you're taking a risk, right? The impulse, the tendency is always, or in almost all cases, based on the wording of the bill, is going to be to just leave the rent at the current level. And not only in the 10% increase that I'm talking about, if you raise it by any amount, 1%, the tenant would still have the opportunity to say that it's unreasonable. They can say,
interesting, because again, government doesn't necessarily understand the workings of business, yet you can increase your revenues, but your expenses, on the other hand, are going to increase. So, there is no equity. There's no sympathy.
No, Mike, you're talking, when you raise items like that, you're speaking logically, and you're speaking how you're bringing in how the real world works. The people behind Good Cause Eviction, right? This is not isolated to New York. There's a movement around the country, and I know you mentioned you don't want to talk politics, but I mean, you have to
Well,
say
let's
it like
talk
it is.
win. Go ahead.
This is a socialist movement that wants to decommodify housing, that thinks that there is a human right to housing, and across the country there is a movement to try to impose various rent control measures to stick it to owners and ensure that tenants can stay in rental apartments, come hell or high water. And if you look at this bill in total, the way I look at it and how I characterize it is it aims to give tenants all of the benefits of property ownership with none of the responsibilities. And on the flip side of the coin, it aims to impose all of the burdens of ownership on the owner with just about none of the benefits.
Right. Right.
And it's really, I mean, it's not an exaggeration. And I think, if you look at, for example, the Twitter feeds of some of the politicians in New York who are in favor and are pushing Good Cause Eviction, they will not be embarrassed to tell you that they're socialists, that they basically want to steal real property from owners. I mean, you have one prominent supporter of Good Cause Eviction in the New York Senate. You go on his Twitter feed and the hashtag is try socialism. You have another very prominent sponsor in the New York Senate who stated to The Real Deal in 2019 that the ownership of private real property is taking property away from the collective. Okay. Now, again, if anybody listening to this podcast is left leaning, or my object isn't to offend anyone, but I mean that's what it is. This is socialism in action.
Well, it's interesting because if you take the people, this politician's Twitter feed, the people who enjoy the trappings of being in power, who aren't really down on the street with the rank and file people who are living day to day, although I don't know that the New York State Senate, they necessarily have the same trappings of power that they do in Washington. But, if you ask the people who moved to America from Venezuela, from Cuba, from these countries that are socialist countries, and ask them what are the benefits of a socialist government, and there really aren't very many. And it's like, it sounds great. It's like everyone, it sounds great, but the end result is not necessarily as great as the overall concept sounds. So
not at all. And I mean, a couple of things to respond to your very good point. You look at who actually owns, and you said this in your opening, you look at who actually owns real property in New York City and who this law would affect, right? Everyone assumes, you listen to the tenant advocates speak, and they talk about owners of real property as if they're all monopoly men with top hats and pipes, and they take a jump off the diving board into a pool of money.
fat cat.
You look at what is really out there. I work with with a bunch of real estate groups and small property ownership groups, and you go to a meeting of a small property ownership group, and what do you see? You see people from all over the world. You see diversity. You see all people of all races, all nationalities, all colors. It's a microcosm of New York City, and they came to this country from countries like the places you mentioned, because they wanted the American dream. They wanted to own real property as a means of financial security,
Growing wealth.
growing wealth. They're providing a service to people who need somewhere to live. And yeah, there are always bad apples. There are always people who do the wrong thing. But the overwhelming majority of these people do the right thing. They
Absolutely.
want stable buildings. They want their buildings rented up. They want to have a good name. And you have the tenant advocates who are just sullying them by just I mean, we're not supposed to stereotype anyone, and no one should be stereotyped based on who they are, but you have tenant advocates gleefully just bashing and doing the most they can to just make the lives miserable of a class of people who they disfavor, and it's really offensive to see.
Here's another story, and I don't know why I'm in such a storytelling mood today, but
It's all good stories, though.
thanks. Well, first of all, the first statistic I'm fairly sure of is that about 70% of multifamily housing units are owned by mom and pops. So I believe that's the statistic. But I read a story this week where there's a couple who owns a Queens two-family. They live in one side, a family lives in the other side. They raised the family's rent $100, which was the first increase they had done in, I think, 10 years. It's a 3-bedroom apartment. I think they went from $1,800 a month to $1,900 a month. And the tenants refused to pay, not the $100 increase. They're not paying the rent. They're now $17,000 in arrears. In order to evict them, I believe there's, and you know this probably better than I do, I think there's a 200,000 case backlog in landlord tenant court. So what is going to happen to this couple who owns a two-family where their tenants won't pay? They're behind 17 grand, money that they'll probably never recoup, even if, and it's just going, the clock's just going to keep ticking. So what happens? Where's the equity in that? Where's the fairness? And yet the courts, I believe, I know they do on Long Island, but I'm pretty sure they do it in the city too, lean to the tenant side.
Yeah, it's less so. My experience has been that the courts are a little more even-handed outside of New York City. But even in New York City, when you have something blatant like that, while judges will look for ways to try to help the tenants, I think even something so blatant as that, eventually, once the 200,000 case backlog is cleared, they will have to ultimately pay the piper. But generally speaking, I saw that story. I think it was in the Post.
It was.
And I think
What I made
many other small owners can tell similar stories, right? And the whole purpose, there are landlord tenant courts, and they're called summary proceedings. Summary proceedings meaning they're supposed to be quick. You're supposed to have your cases adjudicated quickly. Issues are supposed to be decided quickly. The way things have been going, right? Because you had a moratorium for almost 2 years, right? And I don't know if it was by design, but I don't think the people in charge are too upset about the fact that there's a huge backlog, and that the fact that in tenants like these particular tenants aren't going to have to pay the piper for a while. So
but also, like in so many of the the 6 points of the good cause eviction, litigation is very expensive. People always say, what, if you do that again, I'm going to sue you. People say that, but they don't seem to understand that hiring an attorney is not free. So these landlords, not only aren't they getting paid, but now they have to consider the expense of hiring an attorney to get these people out. I mean, it's a difficult situation at best.
Yeah. That's a good place to segue into the rest of the rest of the, this good cause bill, one of the bases for eviction is non-payment of rent. There are a few other bases for eviction. All of them would require the hiring of an attorney, would require litigation, and would require significant expenditure of time and fees to have a chance, even have a chance to evict a problem tenant. So in almost any situation, the path of least resistance is going to be to simply let it be. And if unless someone is burning the place down, and then another part that I think, to add into your point about hiring an attorney, in New York City, there already is a right, if a tenant's income is below a certain level, there already is a right to counsel, right? So you could have a situation where you have a small mom and pop owner who might not even be able to hire an attorney, but then if the tenant's income is below a certain level, that tenant's going to have an attorney. So it's not even a fair fight to begin with, right? I think it's whatever the level. I think it's 200% of the federal poverty level. I think there's a movement to raise that. And in addition, we're talking about the Good Cause bill. There's another bill pending in the state. I don't know what the chances are of passage, but there is a bill pending where any tenant sued in a landlord-tenant proceeding would have a right to counsel, no matter the tenant's income. There could be no income cap. There could be a tenant living in a $10,000 a month luxury apartment who's sued for whatever reason, for non-payment of rent, for doing whatever, and that tenant is going to have a right to counsel paid for by the New York State taxpayers.
Where do those, and it's not going to be a legal aid attorney, it's going to be an attorney from a firm that gets per diem for doing this?
I don't know exactly where the lawyer would come from, but I think it would be some legal services that the tenant would have the right to. The overarching point I'm trying to make is that, we're talking about New York politicians of a certain ideological bent trying to do as much as they can to purposely make real estate owners' lives as miserable as possible, and to make owning real estate so disfavorable that they will sell out, or they'll foreclose, let the city take over, or they'll sell to larger operators who can more easily bear the cost. So where I think they're trying to go is they're trying to get more real estate concentrated in the hands of fewer operators, including the government, including large companies, and then they can control the government. They can lean on private companies to do what they want to do, and eventually this is all just part of the plot to divest real property from the hands of private ownership.
Well, let me ask you this. You had testified about the good cause eviction in front of the New York State Senate.
Right, I did.
What was was that just you or other attorneys as well? Who was in front of them?
So it was actually very interesting. It was a full day. It was a full day hearing, and the way they arranged it was they had different panels of witnesses, right? So they had some people for, some people against. It was, I wouldn't say totally even-handed, but there was definitely plenty of opportunity for people who opposed the bill to speak. So we did have to say. One thing I found very interesting, right? Because obviously there are, large Democratic majorities in both the Senate and the Assembly. But what I found interesting was a lot of the Senate Democrats who are not from New York City, who aren't in the, the very left wing, I noticed at least two, and I believe maybe more, Democratic senators in their questioning seemed very skeptical of this idea. And what I think they were concerned about was the effect of this bill on the value of rental real property. Because remember, if you're, I mean, it's the same way in the city, but especially if you have towns on Long Island or Westchester or elsewhere in the state, real estate taxation is one of, if not the primary source of their local revenue, right? And that's based on tax assessments, which are, at least in theory, based on market value. And if you have bills like this that become law, the only thing they're going to do is depress the market value of rental property. And what's that going to mean? That's going to mean a lower tax base. And what's that going to mean? That's going to mean less money for cops, for teachers, for fire, and for the other services that local governments provide. So I think that is something that's really working against the bill, and notwithstanding the ideological fervor of some of its proponents, I think it's really running aground when you look at the reality of what this bill being law would mean.
That brings me to one of my favorite phrases, which are unintended consequences. So when you propose something that is grandiose and sounds great, but you don't really think of what the ramifications are going to be. You don't really, when you play pool, shoot pool, you have to think 3 moves ahead. I actually play bridge, and hopefully that doesn't date me, but again, what's that?
It's a great game.
Oh, you play?
I used to play spades. I played bridge. I never really got it, but I was always a spades player.
Challenging as hell. But anyway, you have to think, and I think that when politicians come up with great schemes or ideas or whatever they are, they don't necessarily look out and say, what is the end result of this? It could be good, but it could be bad. It could be very bad. It could be very good, but how does the tree grow? And that's one of my issues, is that people don't really consider unintended consequences.
See again, Mike, you're speaking like a logical person who, if you were a legislator, I'm quite sure you would do exactly that. You would look at a proposal, you would look at the pros, look at the cons. Yeah, it does great things, but what are the consequences if this actually passes? Right? That's what someone who's elected to represent constituents should be doing in every case. But look at who is proposing this.
It's
The people who are proposing this are wild-eyed ideologues. They don't care about the consequences. They care about ideology and creating what they deem to be a just world. And if you have to and if you want to make an omelet, you got to break a few eggs. That's their thought process.
About votes too, primarily, but yes, everything else you said is true too. But we're coming to the end. Before we went on camera, you had mentioned that Friday you're going to be doing a podcast, kind of a debate on this subject of good cause eviction. So if people want to, is it live or it's going to be taped?
I believe it's going to be taped, and I don't know. I would love everybody to listen to it. I don't have a website. I don't have a link or anything like that. But I think after Friday, if they want to search the New York City Bar website, at some point soon after this coming Friday, the 25th, it's going to be posted there. I don't know if it's going to be free or if it's for paying members. I don't know, but if you're interested, you can either try to find it at the City Bar website, or you can just reach out to me personally and I'll see what I can do.
That brings us to another issue. How do people get in touch with you if they have questions either about good cause eviction or any other aspect of the law?
Okay, email is the easiest way. You can call me. My direct line is 212-551-8416. My email is my first initial and my last name. That's ALYCOYANNIS @rosenbergestis.com. That's ALYCOYANNIS at ROSENBERGESTIS.com.
You know, when you spelled your last name, I don't know if you were a Barney Miller fan, but
I remember watching the reruns.
well, so there was one of the cops' name was Wojciechowicz, and people would say, "How do you spell that?" And he says, "You spell it like it sounds."
I gotta remember that one.
I always love that. So now, let me thank you for being on. You know what? After you have your debate, or on any other topic, because you're a prolific writer, you know, we would love to have you back on, because you're obviously a man very knowledgeable in his field.
Well, I appreciate that. And also one other thing I want to add, you mentioned being a writer. If you search up my name and just put my name into your favorite search engine, I've written a number of pieces recently. I had an op-ed in the New York Post in mid-February. I also had a couple of other pieces on Good Cause Eviction. One of them was in the Albany Times Union. Another was in Law 360. So just plug my name and Good Cause Eviction into your favorite search engine. And if you want to read any more of my writings, they'll be there. Also, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. Because I post a lot about this topic and other topics relating to real estate on my LinkedIn page. Please connect with me. I love making new connections. I love meeting new people. I love learning new things. And I try to be very accessible to people who are interested in the same things as me or want to know more about things that I know.
No, definitely a friendly guy. I've known Alex now for close to 10 years, and definitely worth reaching out to. So now, if you thought the intro to Do You Ever Wonder was great, now we're gonna go to the outro now. I'd never heard of an outro, but here we go.
Thanks for listening to Do You Ever Wonder? And if there's a subject that's always been on your mind, let us know. We hope you'll join us next time for the show that answers your questions. And please like and share this episode with your friends and on your social media. See you next time.